I've seen storms that rip off your clothes and hell's fire in the eyes of my foes. But avast I declare, lad, you're making me stare, 'cause I've never seen sails quite like those. I'm Jessica Peters, and this is Deep Blue Diaries. The year is 1897. What began as a groundbreaking mission to explore the furthest reaches of the Earth has turned into a nightmare. The crew of the ship Belgica was trapped in an endless sea of ice, and the ship itself turned into a frozen prison. Stranded for an entire Antarctic winter in a place where the sun doesn't rise for 6 months, these men faced unimaginable cold, isolation, and the constant threat of death. Supplies are dwindling, and survival is anything but certain. This is the cursed Belgica Expedition, and the fight for their lives is only just beginning. But before we plunge into this frozen hell, let's rewind. The late 1800s was an age of exploration, mountains to conquer, jungles to chart, but nothing captivated the imagination quite like the polar regions. The Antarctic was the ultimate mystery, an untouched, unforgiving wilderness at the edge of the world. For some, the lure of the unknown was irresistible. And that's where we meet Adrien de Gerlache, who I'm just going to call Adrien. Adrien was a young Belgian naval officer with a bold, reckless vision to lead the first scientific expedition to Antarctica. In 1897, Adrien and his crew set sails into the abyss, determined to push further south than anyone before them. But little did they know they'd be the first people to ever survive an Antarctic winter, though not by choice. Back then, Antarctica was like the moon, unknown, untamed, and terrifying. A few explorers had reached its icy shores, but none had dared venture as far as Adrien's team. And this wasn't just about survival. Adrien's mission was scientific, and he'd pulled together a global crew of experts, a zoologist, a geologist, an oceanographer, meteorologists. The Belgica was packed with bright minds ready to study the most desolate place on Earth. And now would be a good time to introduce you to Dr. Frederick Cook, the American doctor, photographer, and adventurer who joined their adventures. Freddie, or as I like to call him, Sea Daddy. I mean, if you want to see some grade A sailor tale, you have to see old Freddie boy. He may have gotten lost at sea, but he was definitely blown ashore. So here's the thing about Freddie. The journal he kept throughout this whole ordeal is one of the biggest windows we have into these events. I read it, and I'll be referencing it a lot throughout this episode. Unfortunately, Freddie became a controversial figure for a few reasons. See, after the Belgica expedition in 1901, Freddie joined a relief expedition with Robert Peary, another American explorer with whom Freddie had actually gone on another expedition with even before the Belgica in 1891. After the Belgica, Freddie also embarked on two more expeditions, each to Mount McKinley, one in 1903 and the other in 1906. And he claimed to have reached its summit in 1906. In 1907, Freddie set off on a quest to the North Pole, and in 1908, he claimed to have reached it on April 21st. A little over a year later, in September of 1909, Freddie formally announced his discovery of the North Pole, but just a week later, Robert Peary publicly denounced Freddie as a fraud, asserting that Peary himself had been the first to reach the pole. Then just a month later, Freddie's Mount McKinley climbing partner, Ed Barrell, published an affidavit stating that Freddie's diaries from Mount McKinley were false and that his picture of the summit was a fake. It should be noted that Barrell was reportedly paid $5,000 to make this statement. Freddie was unable to discredit the charges of Peary and Barrell, but he still continued to defend his claims. In 1917, Freddie was hired by the New York Oil Company to prospect for oil, and then going on to form the Petroleum Producers Association. Despite these successes, in 1923, Freddie was accused of mail fraud related to his oil business, and he was indicted. He spent 5 years at Leavenworth Prison, where he acted as a prison doctor and was editor of the prison newsletter. Freddie did end up receiving a pardon from Franklin Roosevelt for his mail fraud conviction shortly before his death, which somehow makes this sadder because of all the cool shit you could receive a presidential pardon for. Mail fraud conviction just doesn't seem that cool. I mean, even Martha Stewart was indicted for insider trading. Freddie's supporters claimed that he was the hero of the Belgian Antarctic Expedition, the first to climb Mount McKinley, the first to reach the North Pole, and he was the victim of persecution by Robert Peary and his backers, aka the modern-day version of an influencer sending their followers to mass report the page of another influencer they have beef with. You know, when they're like, Robert Peary's cult members are reporting my page. Critics, however, argued that Cook faked both his Mount McKinley and North Pole achievements. They also alleged that his career was marked by deceit, culminating in his conviction for mail fraud related to the Texas oil lands. All that being said, there will be a lot of quotes taken from Freddie's book about the Belgica ordeal, and for accuracy's sake, I made a point not to pull out the ones where he casts himself as a hero, just in case. You might also recognize the name of Roald Amundsen in there, a young Norwegian man who'd go on to be the first person to reach the South Pole. But on this expedition, he was just cutting his teeth, learning how to not freeze to death while surviving on seal blubber and penguin meat. Not a sea boy, not yet a sea daddy. In addition to a crack crew of sea daddies, Adrian needed a ship, and he found one in the Norwegian whaler called the Patria, which he immediately rebranded as the Belgica. But she needed more than just a name change. The Belgica needed a major overhaul to be ready for the icy conditions it was headed towards. Because the Belgica was originally a whaling ship and not built for extreme polar conditions, its hull was heavily reinforced with extra layers of timber and metal. This was essential to protect the ship from the pressure of the thick, crushing ice it would encounter in the Antarctic waters. To help the crew survive the frigid temperatures of the Antarctic winters, the ship's heating system was upgraded. The crew installed a more efficient stove and heat distribution system to keep the interior livable during the months of darkness and extreme cold. The Belgica's sails and rigging were also improved to optimize its performance in Antarctic weather conditions, where high winds and rough seas were common. This would ensure that the ship had enough power to maneuver in such an extreme environment. Freddie detailed some of the provisions that were brought for their scientific needs, including several thousand pounds of alcohol, large quantities of chemicals to preserve animal specimens, and cotton for stuffing birds. They also brought devices for collecting fish specimens from the middle strata and the deep sea, and he noted that they could even scrape the bed of the ocean for any forms of life, as well as drop a thermometer down to register varying temperatures. He said, "Our cameras are all varieties, and with these we expect to photograph the strange Antarctic life with its immediate surroundings." The ship was also stocked with foods that would last in harsh conditions, such as cereals, grains, coffee, canned meats, preserves, and potatoes, as well as a slew of medical supplies. And for my husband, who asked, as he always asks, what kind of firearms that they carried on the ship, because my husband collects antique firearms, babe, I looked everywhere I could, and I looked through Freddie's journals, and the only entry I found was one where he says, "Although we do not expect to hunt seals or whales or anything else for commercial purposes, the expedition is well prepared to take all kinds of life for scientific study. We have boom and harpoon guns to capture whales and sea elephants. We have rifles, shotguns, pistols, knives, and ammunition to do justice to pirate ships." And that's all I could find. Cross-referencing that with the time, I see that the most likely rifle they carried was the Mauser Model 1889 bolt-action rifle, but I couldn't find much else. That, babe, is up to you. Freddie did also note that they stocked the ship with something called Tonite, Tonite, not to be confused with tonight, like the night. Tonite was an explosive that was used in the late 19th, early 20th century, consisting of equal weights of barium nitrate and gun cotton. And they actually had 2,000 pounds of that on board. And the purpose of that was very specific. It's because they knew there was a good chance that they were going to have to blast through some ice. Now hang on to that little nugget, because we're going to come back to it later. In August of 1897, the ship was ready to set sail from Antwerp, and its departure was well attended. It was a celebrated event. The docks were packed with excited onlookers, including several very prominent figures and supporters, such as King Leopold II of Belgium and the members of the Royal Belgian Geographical Society, who were instrumental in sponsoring and promoting the expedition. They offered a lot of funding for this. And this is where we start our journey. More like a series of unfortunate events. Because if you thought the Belgica only ran into issues once it hit the Antarctica, wait until you hear what happened. I feel like life was foreshadowing to them at every step along the way. Before the Belgica even left Belgium, it was already facing serious issues. The ship was overloaded to the point of strain, and the rough waters of the North Sea made matters even worse, causing the Belgica's engine to falter. With no other option, Adrian had to make an emergency stop in Ostend for repairs. The journey had barely begun, and they were already forced to pull over to quick fix, much to the disappointment of those who had come to see them off. What was meant to be an exciting start to a historic expedition quickly turned into an embarrassing delay. And then it got worse. While still docked in Ostend, 2 crew members quietly abandoned ship, deciding that their future prospects weren't worth the risks ahead. They quietly slipped away during the night. This was a major blow to Adrian. Morale was already shaky, and losing 2 crew members so early on deepened that growing sense of uncertainty, which may have led to the next little incident, which was 2 more sailors sneaking off the ship in the middle of the night to go off drinking, and then coming back on board drunk and disorderly. And by now, I'm sure that Adrian is already growing sick of everyone's shit. Finally, the ship is repaired and the crew set sail once again with renewed hope and optimism until the Belgica faced yet another unexpected and nearly catastrophic mishap where it almost collided with the Belgian royal yacht. Yes, the King's yacht. Barely out of the harbor, they nearly crashed into the King's vessel. And while they did avoid the crash, it was narrow and again, mortifying. A collision with the King's yacht would have been a disaster, quickly turning the expedition into a national embarrassment, which kind of it still did. Nevertheless, the crew persisted and continued onward. But then came the Uruguay incident. By the time the Belgica docked in Montevideo, tensions amongst the crew were high. Despite the fact that many of the crewmen fell in love with Uruguay, devouring the food, and even Ron Amundsen noting in his diary that he had never seen so many beautiful women in one place at the same time, the allure wasn't enough to ease the tension. Julian Sancton, who authored the amazingly researched and detailed book Madhouse at the End of the Earth, the Belgica's Journey into the Dark Antarctic Night, wrote that, quote, the discipline problem aboard the ship would soon prove more consequential than Adrian had imagined. His confident handling a week later of the notorious Pampero winds, chilling southwesterly squalls, bringing cold air from across the South American pampas, and the onboard mayhem that followed after the ship dropped anchor at Montevideo on November 11th showed how much more adept he was at bringing ships to heel than an imposing order among his men. The proximity of land meant the proximity of liquor, which only exacerbated the men's behavior. Alcohol inflamed long smoldering grudges. The initial spark was a newspaper article about the expedition that claimed the Norwegians, because of their familiarity with the cold and their even-keeled demeanor, were better suited to the Antarctic than were the hot-blooded Belgians. The angrier the Belgian sailors got about the article, the more they proved its point. The Belgian ringleader for the night was Frans Dam, and he was spoiling for a fight. These foreigners want to be better than we Belgians, he growled, thumping his barrel of a chest. Since the Belgians and the Norwegians were evenly matched, Dam redirected his liquor-soaked rage at the cook, Frenchman Le Monnier, who was sleeping or attempting to in one of the bunks along the V-shaped forecastle. Months of heaping abuse on his shipmates had left the cook with few allies, even if the only offense he had committed that night had been to prepare a disappointing meal of peas and water. The reckoning had been a long time coming. And I'm just going to interject, I kind of get it. A cook on a ship is important. Hell, prison riots have broken out based on bad food alone. You can't keep men cooped up in isolation, no matter the reason, and serve them bad food. It doesn't go well. Even Freddie once wrote in his diary, quote, next to the captain, the cook is the most important person on the ship. There are short instances where he even rises above the captain. So I get it. A meal of peas and water, I'd be pretty pissed too. Nevertheless, Dom wanted a fight and Dom got it a fight. He picked up one of the huge pans that held the drinking water for the crew and dumped it on Le Monnier's head. Le Monnier was someone who would stand up for himself and also a large man, so he couldn't take that lying down. Literally, he jumped out of his bunk and the two men started fighting. According to Sancton's writing, quote, 2 other men attempted to pull the combatants apart, but ended up pummeling Lemonnier instead. The bloody cook staggered out of the door and across the deck towards the officers' quarters. Back in the flooded forecastle, the mood had improved since ousting the common enemy. The Belgians, realizing that they would have to account for their actions in the morning, resolved to tell Adrian that either the cook or they would have to go. The Norwegians, who had their own grievances against Lemonnier and no desire to further antagonize Dom and the man who had jumped in, Van Dam, agreed to back them up. As one of the other sailors, Carl Wenck, wrote in his diary, the water was soon mopped up, overturned tables were picked up, and bottles that had been stowed in the forepeak for safety's sake were steadily opened. The festivities continued until 3 a.m, with the Belgians and the Norwegians and the Polish scientist singing arm in arm, alternating choruses of their respective national anthems. The next morning, the captain of the ship, Captain George Lecointe, saw Lemonier's face and obviously had heard all of the boisterous carousing and opened an immediate investigation. Lecointe called each of the men in one by one to his quarters to determine what happened. And the crew had already conspired to frame Lemonnier, and they all reported the same lies and half-truths in their interviews with the captain. The cook had started the fight. What's more, he had grossly insulted Adrian and the other officers, and finally, the crew insisted that Lemonnier planned to sabotage the expedition because he blamed Adrian for having prevented him from becoming the personal chef for King Leopold II. Faced with this united front, Lecointe had no choice but to send Lemonnier packing. He passed on the news to Adrian, who feared that the crew was only growing more disorderly as they approached the Antarctic. The commandant hired a Swede to replace Lemonnier, but the new hire immediately fell ill and had to be disembarked, and that is when Van Dam, who had just beaten the shit out of the other cook, was promoted to the cook. And this isn't the last you'll hear about Van Dam, because this guy was a cunt, so keep his name in the back of your mind. But finally, the ship was fixed, things were looking up, and then you will never believe what happened. The ship took off from Montevideo, but somewhere between Montevideo and Punta Arenas, the ship's engineer did the unthinkable. He let the boiler run dry. Am I joking? Babe, I'm not joking. He had one fucking job, and he did it terribly. For those who are nautical novices, the boiler is the heart of the engine. Without steam, the Belgica might as well have been a fancy raft. In extreme cases, a dry boiler doesn't just quit, it can explode. Luckily, the Belgica avoided a full-on disaster, but damage was done. The ship was dead in the water until the mechanical issues could be sorted. Adrian didn't waste any time. As soon as they limped into Punta Arenas on December 1st, 1897, he promptly kicked the engineer to the curb. So, they're in Punta Arenas, the last major stop before the Belgica hits the Antarctic. They were undermanned and nursing a busted engine. And then who decides to rear his ugly, cunty head and make things a million times worse? You guessed it, our old buddy Van Dam. While stranded in Punta Arenas, the crew hit their breaking point. Frustrations were boiling over and chaos started to creep in. With so many things going wrong and troublemakers stirring the pot, it didn't take much for tensions to snap. Even in calm seas, the mental toll of being stuck at sea can push people to their limits, and that's exactly what happened. Key crew members had a habit of getting drunk and picking fights. Van Dam, Dom, and a few others were becoming audacious as they tested their leadership, who, to be honest, was not up to the task of keeping order amongst a crowd of raucous men. It wasn't long before the influence of the bad crew started to affect the good crew, and insubordination amongst the crew surged. The men began to leave the ship whenever they felt like it, getting drunk, fighting, and finding women to have fun with. One night, Van Dam showed up at Adrian's door, demanding an advance on his wages so he could go ashore. Adrian refused, saying that not only did Van Dam not have permission to go ashore, but he'd already spent more than he was to earn for the entire expedition. When Van Dam then threatened to quit, Adrian decided he'd had enough and stood up to him. No, I'm just kidding. That's what he should have done. Adrian, who feared losing one of his few experienced mariners, who was now also the cook, gave him money and let him go ashore. So essentially, Van Dam, arguably the worst person on the ship, was handed more power by becoming a cook, in a sense, becoming indispensable. And now he could do whatever the hell he wanted, and he knew it. What Adrian did, I'm not sure what it's called in sailor terms, but in civilian life, we call that a bitch move. And that made Van Dam even worse. He talked several other crewmen into going ashore with him, and they had another all-night bender. The next day, when officers sent men to retrieve them, Van Dam told them, no, and the crew members who were with him followed his lead. When Van Dam finally returned to the ship, he decided to pack his bag and leave again, and Dom went to his room to sleep off the booze from the night before. Mind you, they were supposed to be working. When officers asked them what they were doing, they told the officers to leave them alone, which is insolent as hell. Upon witnessing Van Dam packing clothing that belonged to the ship, and not him, Adrian finally found his water logs and demanded the clothing back. In response, Van Dam got in his face and let loose a slew of insults. And this was the point of no return for Adrian. Van Dam was being outright aggressive now, and he had to stand up to him because he knew all too well that this was the makings of a mutiny. The problem was there were quite a few sailors on board who were unhappy with their chain of command as well as guns, and Adrian knew that the situation could quickly become violent. At this point, he needed help. He had the ship fly a red flag from the main mast, a signal to the Punta Arenas Port Authority and Chilean Navy that they needed help ASAP. But here's the thing. It's not like it's calling 911 and they arrive quickly. It took them all night, which meant that these men were in an intense and probably at times awkward standoff for hours all night. But finally, a detachment from the Chilean Navy showed up, boarded the vessel, and ordered the men to pack their bags and get off the ship. Van Dam, determined to not go so quietly, packed his bags and then set off to confront Adrian one more time. Upon finding him, he let off more threats and insults before producing a diary where he claimed to have extensively journaled everything that happened on board and said he would be publishing it as soon as he got back to Belgium, which is like the old-timey version of saying, I'm recording you and I'm going to upload this to TikTok. And with that, he and the other derelicted sailors were marched off the boat. And if you're saying to yourself, finally, Adrian stood up for himself, well, just before they got off the boat, Adrian caught up with them and gave them each money, hush money, to not publish what was in that diary. I personally would have punched the fucker right in the face, but that was another way to go. While order was restored and peace fell over the ship once more once those guys were gone, the Belgica left Punta Arenas even more undermanned than before. Now, Adrian was leading a skeleton crew into the most hostile environment on Earth. His personal attendant, Luis Michaud, was promoted to cook, despite not being a cook, and this would later have dire consequences. But the ship forged ahead, and not long after they arrived at the South Shetland Islands in Antarctica, which are only 2,000 miles away from Uruguay, for anyone else wondering why they stopped there and how they got there so fast. I looked it up. That's a thing we know now. So here we are in the Antarctics. They made it. They finally made it after all of that, and they can breathe a huge sigh of relief because it's all gravy from here, right? Well, the Belgica arrived in Antarctica on January 20th, 1898. And as if they hadn't faced enough disaster, the Southern Ocean decided to remind them that it could get worse. Just 2 days later, on January 22nd, 1898, during a severe storm, 19-year-old sailor Carl Wank had been tasked with clearing the scuppers, the drainage outlets on the ship's deck, which they'd become blocked with coal during a storm. As Freddie wrote in his diary, quote, at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Amundsen and I were on the bridge, straining our eyes and leveling our glasses on a mysterious black object ahead, directly in our course. While thus engaged, we heard an unearthly cry, a cry which made me shiver because of its force and painful tone. We turned about quickly, but I saw nothing to indicate the direction of the noise. Amundsen, thinking there had been an accident in the engine room, rushed in that direction. I went aft to the quarterdeck and, looking astern, saw a man struggling among the foamy crests. It was Wank, and trying to free the scuppers, he had lost his balance, and in falling, he had uttered the awful cry which had startled us. With quick presence of mind, he sought the log line and grasped it. I caught hold of the other end and began to draw it slowly in, but he slipped until his hand was stopped by the log. Upon this, he held with a death-like grasp. Before I had pulled in the full length of the line, everybody was on the deck. But there was little to be done. With the tossing the ship about like a chip and the wind blowing a gale, it was impossible to lower the boat. As I brought Wenk closer to the stern, LeQuant, with a bravery impossible to appreciate, volunteered to be lowered into the icy seas to pass a rope around the poor fella. He followed his offer with demands for a rope, which was securely fastened around his waist. With 2 men at the rope, LeQuant was lowered into the churning waters, but he sank at once with the counter eddies and nearly lost his own life without being able to keep near Wenk. LeQuant was raised, and without delay or undue excitement, we managed to tow Wenk to the side of the ship, where we expected to lower another man. But while we were doing this, he gave up his grip on the log and sank. We waited there for an hour, but saw no more of our unfortunate shipmate. Wenk was a boy with many friends, and his absence was deeply felt in our little party. So, despite the valiant attempt to save him, the sea had killed Carl. It killed Coral! His death was deeply felt by the crew, marking the first life lost during the expedition. Wenk Island, located in the Palmer Archipelago near the Antarctic Peninsula, became the crew's tribute to their lost shipmate. And it is not the same island he died on. I checked. That would have been weird. Now, the Belgica crew did some solid sciencing before and even after they got stuck. In fact, many of their discoveries were groundbreaking. One of the major accomplishments was mapping new areas, including the discovery and charting of islands like Wenk Island and establishing the existence of Belgica Strait, now known as Gerlache Strait. They charted numerous islands and made 20 separate landings to observe and document previously unknown areas. They also conducted extensive magnetic studies to improve understanding of Earth's magnetic field in the polar regions. The ship's crew also made astronomical observations that helped refine knowledge about the magnetic pole's position. Hourly weather observations were recorded, which provided invaluable data to Antarctic climate patterns. These measurements were critical for understanding weather in the polar regions, which was poorly understood at the time. Emil Rakovica, the expedition's naturalist, studied Antarctic wildlife, making observations of penguins, seals, and other marine animals. He discovered Belgica Antarctica, the first flightless midgefly found in Antarctica, and documented some of the first flowering plants of the region. These discoveries were critical for understanding the unique biodiversity of the Antarctica. And finally, the crew took deep-sea soundings to map the sea floor and collected water samples to study ocean currents and temperatures. This helped develop early knowledge of Antarctic oceanography, which was critical for future expeditions. Despite harsh conditions and limited resources, the scientific work done by the Belgica contributed significantly to early Antarctic research and laid the groundwork for future exploration. And in spite of the numerous setbacks and their recent tragic loss, the magnitude of what they were seeing was not lost on any of them. Wrote Freddie, the scientific men are scattered about, some in the mast, some on the bridge, and others on the poop, all looking anxiously for surprises in the new life and scenes about us. Even the sailors cannot resist the temptation to stand still and drink with awe-inspiring amazement the strange wine of action which hangs over the mysterious whiteness of this new world of ice. The Belgica continued onward for weeks, with Freddie documenting every bit of the journey, from the excruciating to the mundane to the downright nerve-wracking. A journal entry dated February 18th at 6 a.m. read, "Those of us not directly connected with the navigation of the bark and the men off watch slept very little last night. The noise of the larger pans as they struck the ship and the grating and rasping of the smaller fragments as the Belgica was forced through the ice was such that sleep was impossible. We were all anxious and uneasy. There was little wind, but it was dark and foggy, and icebergs were everywhere to be expected. Mentally, another berg collision was constantly before us, and every unusual thump suggested a calamity. As the purple gray of dawn illuminated the horizon eastward, our hearts beat more easily and our minds were more at rest, though the new scene which now lay before us was the most hopeless, icy desolation which, to the present, it had been our lot to see. Other times, there's some eerie foreshadowing, despite this being a day-by-day account. On February 20th, he wrote, "At 10 o'clock, we reached a point where the main body of the pack again refused us path. The Belgica, however, will not be discouraged. She plows on between the heavy masses of ice to some open lakes beyond, where she seems to gain fresh courage and then rushes upon the offending fields with a spirit of animation altogether in keeping with that of her directors. Most of the men are standing about on the decks, offering words of encouragement to the bark as she batters and breaks the offending floes which hinder her passage. A few men sitting on the anchor chains have premonitions of impending danger and discuss the prospects of an Antarctic winter and the incidents of starving and freezing cast adrift on the ice. By February 23rd, the pack ice was becoming a bigger problem. Pack ice is areas of sea ice that's not attached to land and is made of small pieces of ice that are frozen together, kind of like when you pour a drink into a cup of ice and the ice welts together into an ice clump. As the pack ice becomes a bigger problem for the ship, a divide begins to grow between the crew, as some want to turn back and others want to forge ahead. Roald Amundsen writes in his diary, "Unfortunately, the scientists are showing great signs of fear. They are reluctant to go further into the ice. Why then have we come here? Is it not to explore the unknown realms? This cannot be done by lying still outside the ice and dozing off." By February 25th, a week before getting trapped, more of the crew started to become uneasy with the sheer amount of pack ice around the ship. By this point, they were familiar with what Freddie referred to as the ensnaring power of pack ice. They'd already become entangled in it several times, being stuck for a few days at a time before making their way out again. To make matters worse, the choppy waves had made more than half the crew become violently seasick. They recognized that at this point, being entangled could be dire and potentially mean they'd be trapped, with Freddie writing, "The nights are becoming long and black, and new ice is forming on every side. But in spite of these forbidding signs, Adrian believes it's incumbent upon himself to abandon the new program and push heedlessly into the freezing water to make as strong an effort as possible to beat the farthest south of other explorers. The entire scientific staff are opposed to this effort because it is thought too late in the season. No direct opposition, however, was offered when the Belgica was again headed southward," which for anyone who's worked with an overzealous company founder, this should sound familiar and reminds us of two important lessons. Number one, remember, whether you live in 1886 or 2024, employers don't give a shit about your personal well-being or safety when their personal accomplishments are at stake. And number two, speak up. Even leaders make bad decisions, especially leaders make bad decisions. February 28th, 3 days before being trapped, Freddie writes, "Every swell that drives against the ship brings with it tons of ice, which is thrown against her ribs with thundering crash. The wind howls as it rushes past us and comes with a force which makes us grasp the rails to keep from being thrown into the churning seas. The good old ship keeps up a constant scream of complaints as she strikes piece after piece of the masses of ice. Occasionally, we try to talk, but the deafening noises of the storm, the squeaking strains of the ship, and the thumping of the ice makes every effort at speech inaudible. With our stomachs dissatisfied and our minds raised to fever heat of excitement, and with the prospect of striking an iceberg at any moment and sinking to the bottom of the sea, we were, to say the least, uncomfortable. When we had sufficiently entered into the body of the pack and were snugly surrounded by closely packed ice, the sea subsided, and here the overworked ship rested for the night." As the Belgica entered the dense ice field, the ship was soon surrounded by towering icebergs and vast stretches of ice floes. The crew struggled to navigate through narrow leads in the ice, but on March 2nd, 1898, the ship became completely beset by the pack ice, with Freddie saying, "We became hopelessly stuck in the ice after penetrating 90 miles into the pack. Despite our attempts to work the ship through the leads of open water, each day brought more ice and less hope." Once trapped, immediate efforts were made to free the ship, with Freddie noting, "We are not yet prepared to resign ourselves to the doubtful destiny of an unknowable life in the restless sea of ice. We still hope against hope that some favorable force will separate the ice and permit us to retreat. Day after day, we have tried to slide into some promising lead, but each effort has been a bitter disappointment." By March 13th, the crew had all but given up being able to free the ship, and most agreed that they were stuck there through the winter. At this point, a feeling of collective resentment was arising towards Adrian, blaming him for entering the main body of all the ice pack given the season they were in. The men aired out their grievances from time to time, something Freddie called a safety valve to let off the mounting frustration. In spite of all of this, the men do try to make the best of the situation, passing time by singing, dancing, playing the accordion, and telling funny stories. And resigned to what lay ahead of them, the men began to prepare for the long winter. The crew set to restoring coal and rearranging their provisions. The scientists made plans for a full year of observation, and the cook began figuring out ways to improvise their rations of food. By April, the men had begun to settle into their new normal, but thoughts of the world going on without them and the things they missed the most crossed their minds, especially women. To pass the time, a few of the guys came up with the idea of a beauty contest, as they called it. Someone had brought aboard a journal from Paris that was full of illustrations of women, almost 500 pictures in various poses and states of undress. For several days, the crew of the Belgica put immense thought, discussion, and debate into the merits of the women before assigning winners of their beauty contest. The general conditions of this beauty contest were written as follows. The photographs of the beauties to enter into the contest are filed in the minister's book. There are 464 pictures, charms, delights, and fascinations, but voters are cautioned not to become too enthusiastic or overheated. Those carrying photographs of favored beauties in their pockets and pinned to their vests, as nearly as possible to their hearts, may submit them for inspection to the minister. It is hoped that the election will be honorable, but all is fair in love and war and in the ladyless South. Swindling of all kinds is allowable, providing it is in an honorable cause. The contest was divided into 4 parts. The first part being total of votes for the most beautiful women, with the women being voted on things like their poses, their disposition. The second was total of votes on the excellence of special parts, which included most beautiful face, luxuriant hair, flashing eyes, mouth with Cupid's bow, arms, sloping alabaster shoulders, supple waists, legs, and feet. In the third part of the contest, each men voted the most suitable wife for their fellow crew members, and each voter had to accept the woman who was selected by his companions as most suitable for his welfare. These women were assigned by the page number they were on, and while Adrian, Captain LeQuant, and Freddie received votes for pages 94, 209, and 88, the ship's oceanographer and meteorologist, Henrik Arktowski, notably received pages 324, 326, and 392 with a small footnote that said one was not sufficient. And finally, part 4 of this beauty contest, the umpires will decide which girl will be likely to be preferred by the various, quote, wandering willies of the expedition. By June, the men had been stuck for 3 months, and now they'd officially entered into Antarctic winter, which meant they were in constant darkness. The scientists still worked tirelessly, collecting every sample they could get their hands on, packing away specimens in what was now their dark laboratories on the ship, making notes and trying their best to view what they could under their microscopes. But it wasn't long before the constant darkness started to get the best of the men, and they found their energy levels steeply declining, with Freddie noting, day after day, week after week, and month after month, we rise at the same hour, eat the same things, talk on the same subjects, make a pretense of doing the same work, and look out upon the same icy wilderness. We try to introduce new topics for thought and new concoctions for the weary stomach. We strain the truth to introduce stories of home and of flowery future prospects, hoping to infuse a new cheer, but it all fails miserably. We are under the spell of the black Antarctic night, and like the world which it darkens, we are cold, cheerless, and inactive. We have aged 10 years and 30 days. By this point, the men had eaten as much canned food as they could handle. They tried penguin meat, but a majority of the crew found the flavor to be too fishy. The men began to eat less and less, not because of food scarcity, but because they had grown such a disdain for the available food that they could no longer stomach it. They could stomach the foods that retained the appearance of their original form, such as ham, bacon, dried meats, and even preserved fruits and vegetables. But unfortunately, that only made up a small part of their food pantry. The bulk of their food was canned mush and hashes, mystery soups, and fish balls. The men missed actual fiber and food that required them to use their teeth. The men developed what they would come to refer to as polar anemia. Their stomachs were constantly sick, they'd become pale, and they experienced cardiac symptoms such as weak and irregular heartbeats. Slowly, the men became less able to concentrate and would often start sentences and not be able to finish them. Chief among the suffering was Lieutenant Emil Danko, a geophysicist who, I also must say, was quite the sea daddy. The crew of the Belgica was nothing if not good looking. The crew began to notice that walking for too long left Danko gasping for breath, with Freddie making this entry in his journal. He has an old heart lesion, a leak of one of the valves, which has been followed by an enlargement of the heart and a thickening of its walls. In ordinary conditions, when there is no need for an unused physical or mental strain, and when liberal fresh food and bright sunshine were at hand, he felt no defect. But these conditions are now changed. The hypertrophied muscular tissue is beginning to weaken, and atrophy of the heart is the result, dilating and weakening with a sort of measured step, which, if it continues at the present rate, will prove fatal within a month. On July 5th, 1898, Freddie wrote, "Today we have to record the darkest page in our log, the death of our beloved comrade Danko. It has not been unexpected, for we have known that he could not recover, but the awful blank left by his demise is keenly felt, and the sudden gloom of despair thus thrown over the entire party is impossible of description. Poor fellow. In the past 48 hours, he had been steadily improving, and although we were not encouraged by this, he felt so much better that he was cheerful and altogether more like his former self. But it was the calm before the storm. Without any premonition of his coming death, Danko passed away easily tonight. His last words to me were, 'I can breathe lighter and will soon get strength.'" On June 7th, the crew wrapped Danko's body in sailcloth and used axes and chisels to cut a hole in the ice. As the men pulled Danko's body over the ice, they talked about how Danko was a favorite among the sailors, that he'd be missed in the forecastle as much as he was missed among the other scientists. At the edge of the icy hole that had been chiseled, the command gave a few words on behalf of Danko before two heavy weights were attached to his feet and he was sent deep into the Antarctic Ocean. Amundsen noted in his diary, "Danko was buried yesterday at midday. Every man was present. It was a rare sight. At the head, the sledge with the body, then a crowd of silent, serious men. The moon cast its sad light over the moving scene." Like Wenck before him, the crew commemorated Danko with a little plot of namesake land. A portion of the west coast of the Antarctic Peninsula between Cape Sterneck and Cape Renard is now known as Danko Coast. Needless to say, this tragic loss took an enormous toll on the crew, whose physical and mental health was already failing. Freddie noted, "There are none among us sick at this time. We may at any moment have small complaints, which will become serious under this death-dealing spell of despair. We are constantly picturing ourselves, the form of our late companion, floating about in a standing position with the weights to his feet, under the frozen surface and perhaps under the Belgica." As the men pushed through the unbelievably bleak existence they were contending with, it wasn't long before they were dealt another blow. Nansen was the ship's cat, a kitten. When their journey began, one of the sailors from Europe had brought him aboard, and the crew took to him immediately. While Nansen did occasionally venture out of the ship, accompanying his companions on short expeditions, he was mostly contented in his little bed by the ship's warm stove or in the bed of his favorite sailor. But Nansen, too, had begun to fall ill. For nearly a month, he'd slowly stopped eating and started sleeping more. Whereas he'd formerly relished any attention and affection the ship's crew bestowed on him, he didn't want to be bothered. The crew tried what they could to arouse some energy into him, including bringing him a penguin to see if they'd become friends and offer Nansen some companionship. Unfortunately, both the penguin and Nansen were unimpressed with the other and stayed on opposite corners of the room. On June 26th, barely 3 weeks after losing Danko, the crew lost Nansen. Freddie wrote in his journal, quote, "We are glad that his torture is ended, but we miss Nansen very much. He has been the attribute to our good fortune to the present, the only speck of sentimental life within reach. We have showered upon him our affections, but the long darkness has made him turn against us. In the future, we shall be without a mascot, and what will be our fate?" By July, the crew's health was failing so badly that Freddie knew something had to be done. Most of the men, including himself, had daily complaints of weakness, heart arrhythmia, mental lethargy, and general pain. The only one who didn't complain was Captain LeCointe, who had a constant barrage of work, making nautical observations, positioning outdoor instruments throughout the day, hunched in uncomfortable positions for an hour at a time. But he'd still come in freezing cold with a smile on his face. Despite that, Freddie began to notice physical changes in LeCointe during regular physical exams. His pulse was becoming intermittent, his skin more pale, and there was a puffiness under his eyes. Freddie noted that LeCointe was eating less and found it difficult to sleep and breathe. The symptoms were eerily too similar to those experienced by Danko before he died. At this point, alarmed himself, LeCointe made out his last will and testament. Even Freddie admitted to feeling hopeless about the situation, and it sent a new wave of despair through the already dejected crew. Freddie saw an uptick in sailors coming to him for medical treatment for new ailments, some real, some imagined. Acute hypochondria was setting over the ship. Determined to not lose any more men, Freddie devised a treatment plan that the sailors dubbed the baking treatment. As soon as one of the crew showed signs of an irregular pulse or a pulse that rose to 100 beats per minute, accompanied by puffy eyes and swollen ankles, he was stripped down and placed close to the fire for 1 hour per day. All food was prohibited except milk, cranberry sauce, and other penguin or seal meat fried in a margarine type substance. The men were forbidden from doing anything taxing to the heart, and his bedding was dried daily, with his clothing carefully adjusted according to the needs of his occupation. Strychnine was also used to regulate the heart. And all credit to Freddie, he openly recognized how important caring for mental health was in all of this, writing, "But surely one of the most important things was to raise the patient's hopes and instill a spirit of good humor. When afflicted, the men felt that they would surely die, and to combat the spirit of abject hopelessness was my most difficult task. My comrades, however, were excellent aids, for as soon as one of our numbers were down, everybody made air of good cheer about him." Needless to say, Captain LeCointe was one of the first men to receive the baking treatment, receiving up to 2 hours of heat therapy per day and eating penguin steaks every day. Within 2 weeks, he was out of bed and back to his post. And by July 22nd, things were about to look up tremendously. Captain LeCointe, through tracking their position, had predicted that they would finally get something they'd been in desperate need of for months: the sun. According to LeCointe's calculations, dawn would finally break at around 12 noon. It was the first time in months that a sense of elation had rippled through the entire crew. By 11 a.m., every single man on board had chosen a special spot, elevated as much as possible, to watch the coming sun. At 11:30 a.m., clouds spread in the sky, under which the men reported seeing an array of colors: gold, orange, blue, green, violet. At precisely 12 p.m., a fiery cloud separated, showing off the upper rim of the sun. Everyone was silent, with awe spreading over their faces. Freddie noted of his companions, quote, "Their eyes beamed with delight, but under this delight there was noticeable the accumulated suffering of 70 dayless nights. Their faces were drawn and thin, though the weight of their bodies was not reduced. The skin had a sickly, jaundiced color, green and yellow and muddy. Even though they wouldn't see the full sun for 3 more days, the improvement in morale was palpable. They played card games with more vigor, laughter rang louder, and there was a buzz in the air. Playing for imaginary money, Freddie happily reported that he'd won $250,000 in that night's card game. By the end of July, the sun was finally back in the sky, and the men would actually feel heat from it. They were described as smiling as happy as a child with a new toy, and immediately planned on a hike several days long, after which improvements in their health began fairly rapidly. Between a boost in mental health and a much-needed dose of vitamin D from the sun, they were probably flying pretty high. By December, the sun finally positioned itself so that the temperatures were steadily rising, and the men noticed that the snow on the pack was melting quickly. In fact, the ship now had a small area of water around it rather than ice for the first time since arriving. Despite this, the main pan of the ice that was blocking the ship, which was about 7 miles in circumference, was taking forever to melt. The men watched small pieces fall off the edge with optimism, but as Freddie noted, even if the Belgica were free in the water at that moment, they would still have to wait because the ice was so closely packed. On New Year's Eve, with new winds blowing west, it was sending the ship in the northern direction, loosening the ice packs and breaking up some of the floes. At midnight, renewed by the help of the winds and the dawn of a new year, the officers and scientists loaded up, generous portions of wine, cheese, ham, and bread, and surprised the sailors below deck, who received them with song and music. That night, the crew of the Belgica drank, ate, told stories, and laughed until their cheeks hurt. As they headed into January, the crew knew that they had to take action to free the ship before they got stuck for another winter. With Freddie writing, quote, "To do something in this direction, I submitted yesterday a plan to the Commandant. It is based on the fact that the sun acts much more powerfully upon water and upon everything a dark color than upon snow. Keeping in mind, my suggestion involves the digging of 2 trenches, one from the bow, the other from the stern to the water at the edge of the Belgica. These trenches are to be carried through the snow and the superficial freshwater sheet of ice, leaving a narrow current of water from the ship to the lead, which we hope by the aid of the sun will so weaken the ice in this direction that it may break in this line. Otherwise, it might fracture. If it fractured at all, a mile to the other side of us, and then our position would be no better than it is now." The men first tried to use explosives to blast through the ice, but their explosives barely made a dent. They then spent weeks working constantly in shifts with saws, picks, and axes to manually cut through the ice. No man was too good for this extended, excruciating manual labor. The commandant, captain, first officers, and scientists all worked shoulder to shoulder with the sailors, with the meteorologists noting, "There simply exists no longer a commandant, no captain, no officers. We are all ordinary workmen." It often felt like the weather was working against them. Well, because it was. Imagine trying to wiggle out of a straitjacket that keeps tightening on you. That's what the ice was doing, constantly shifting due to the Antarctic winds and currents. The work was grueling, with Freddie writing, quote, "I have had little time to write for 1 week. 8 hours daily with a heavy saw and the spine-twisting semicircular is not conducive to literary ambitions. It is, however, a capital exercise. Everybody is being hardened to the work and developing ponderous muscles. Our skin is burnt until it has the appearance of the inner surface of boot leather. Our hands, we have found by experience, are more comfortable if not washed, especially with soap, because then they crack and become more painful. The result is that we all have a more savage physical appearance, but this is of little consequence to us. There are no ladies here to arouse the sleeping vanity, which we all once possessed, and our one ambition is to free this ship. This now seems quite certain. We eat like bears the meat of seals and penguins twice daily, disposing of 3, 4, and 5 steaks each. We find time and gastric capacity for no less than 7 meals daily. All work was stopped Sunday morning at 4 a.m., and it began again at Monday at 8 a.m. During that time, we slept no less than 36 hours, and 12 hours is about an average of our daily sleep with the channel work. Before the canal was begun, we could barely sleep 8 hours. By the beginning of February, the men had cut out a canal from the ocean towards the Belgica, with only about 100 feet of ice left to cut and finally free her. But the ice left to cut through was far thicker than what they'd been working with, between 6 to 7 feet thick, and a consistency so hard that their saws barely did a thing. In one spot, the men sawed for 8 hours, and when it was over, had cut less than 5 feet. Not long after that, the wind changed directions, causing a fracture in the ice surrounding their canal, opening a new crevice, and in doing so, partly closed their canal. On top of that, the positioning of the ice now left the Belgica subjected to a dangerous pressure. The men immediately set out to relieve this pressure by cutting an oblong concavity in the body of the main floe housing the ship. On February 13th, when they finally completed this task, they noted that despite their success in relieving all pressure on the ship, the canal they'd spent so much time on was now closed by new ice. However, the next morning the wind changed again. The pack expanded, leaving leads wide open on all sides and opening the canal. Freddie noted that the men wasted 0 time steaming out of this, writing, quote, "No body of men were ever happier than the officers and crew of the Belgica as the good ship thumped the edge of the ice which had held her a prisoner for nearly a year. Our supply of provisions did not permit a continuation of the campaign, and after all, our mission was about fulfilled. Accordingly, we headed northward in the most direct manner for the open sea. In 2 days, we pushed through closely packed ice 20 miles northward, and then we entered a zone of the pack where the ice was broken into small pieces and closely pressed by an almost continuous line of icebergs. Beyond the bergs, there was a dark blue-black sky, which after a time we recognized as a water sky, indicating that under it there was the open, ice-free Pacific. While the open sea was just in their sightline, the ship was once again imprisoned by the closely packed ice. For an additional 30 days, the men were stuck, staring at the expansive sea ahead of them. They could taste it. The Antarctic was merely toying with them at this point. But just as they had almost abandoned hope again, a gentle southern wind kicked up, driving them with the sea ice out beyond the line of the icebergs, and they suddenly found themselves in the open sea unencumbered by ice. Freddie noted, quote, "At least we feel again the pleasure of being out of the frigid stillness and on the bound of the broad ice-free waters. There is still a long spread of tempestuous waters between us and Punta Arenas, the nearest outpost of civilization. And as we plow this hopeless sea with souls raised to a fever heat of anticipation, our old winged companions in the long drift with the frozen sea leave us." He went on to say that even though they were relieved to finally be heading home, it was bittersweet, writing, quote, "We believed that we had seen all of their cold white world that we had ever desired, but even before we have felt the heat of the sunny inner zones, we're half sorry to leave this weird otherworld life. A year hence, I am sure we shall all long to return again to this death-like sleep of the snowy southern wilderness, but just at present, we long, as no tongue can tell, for the kindly breast of Mother Earth, with her soul-stirring warmth, her running streams, her sweet-smelling flowers, and her air of color, of perfume, and of pleasant musical sounds." On the morning of March 28th, 1899, a year and a month after getting stuck in the Antarctic, the Belgica steamed into the port of Punta Arenas. The crew of the Belgica immediately left the ship. Freddie noted that several of the sailors stayed right there on the beach, playing in the sand with the delight of children for hours. The officers immediately set off to find a hotel, Freddie noting that their first walk on solid ground in 15 months had them looking like they were drunk. They'd traveled on skis and snowshoes or been tossed around by the sea and had forgotten how to walk normally, which caused a stir amongst the first women they saw. In fact, the first women they'd seen in over a year. This leads to one of my favorite passages in Freddie's journal, where he writes, "We had hardly learned to realize this ourselves when we got a glimpse for the first time in many long months of a woman. She simply stood and stared at us, and we at her. And then she gathered up a couple of youngsters nearby and rushed away from us into the house, as if we were dangerous characters. Morally hurt by this incident, we went along taking notice of the men who eyed us with considerable interest. Presently, we passed a door in which two pretty girls were standing. This sight sent a new sensation through us like that of a ferretic battery. Somehow we all, at the same time, unconsciously brushed aside the year's growth of hair from our faces and made an effort to arrange our neckties and change the set of our coats. But we were made to realize more and more we looked hideous. The girls gave a sudden giggle, rushed back into the hall, and we had to content ourselves with the rustle of skirts. This rustle of the skirts of these girls who warmed our frozen hearts would make spicy poetry if we dared to write it. But we are not poets. We must hasten to the hotel where we hope quickly to change our freak-like appearance." Once they'd gotten to their hotel, they were able to take a good look at themselves. And as you can imagine, they looked rough. Their skin was rough, their hair was long and unruly, their clothing had seen better days. The men immediately went to the barber to get cleaned up before heading to the tailor to order presentable clothing. They were brought all of their mail, a bulk of correspondences, including business letters, drafts, and papers, all of which Freddie said were immediately thrown to the side when they found what they were each looking for. Series of letters for each of them that were clearly written by the hands of women back home. One officer immediately joked, "Surely the indications here are that in 6 months there will be as many new wives as the present number of bachelors on the Belgica." It was shortly thereafter that they ordered dinner, their first dinner off the ship in over a year, with a menu that didn't consist of canned meat that tasted like cod liver oil. Freddie wrote, "I should be ashamed to confess the amount of beefsteak, which we devoured. Most of the men stayed in South America for a few weeks, readjusting to civilization, soaking up the sun, and sharing their findings with the scientific community. The scientific community and beyond around the world gave the men due praise for what they'd been through. Adrien de Gerlache received the King's Medal and became a bit of a celebrity in explorer and science circles, receiving invitations to lecture and recount the survival and discoveries made by his crew. Our buddy Dr. Freddie Cook also received acclaim for his baking method, saving the men from what would later be identified as scurvy. And then there's Roald Amundsen, who went on to become a legend, being the first person to reach the South Pole. Bro just liked the icy chill. Some of the crew continued to sail, while others decided to stay firmly on land. But for that year of icy hell, they were part of something extraordinary. And to this day, we have Wank Island and Danko Coast as a reminder. In the end, the Belgica expedition wasn't just about getting stuck in ice for over a year. It was about pushing the boundaries of human endurance, scientific discovery, and exploration. They paved the way for future polar adventures and showed that even in the most extreme conditions, humans could adapt, survive, and learn. Their story might not have had a Hollywood ending, but it laid the groundwork for some of the greatest Antarctic journeys to come. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Jessica Peters. All of my sources for this episode are in the show notes, but I want to particularly acknowledge author Julian Sancton and his book, Madhouse at the End of the Earth, the Belgica's Journey into the Dark Antarctic Night. You can follow me on Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, YouTube, all JessthePrequelDoesMiami, or you can simply search Miami Cougar. While I do spout fictional nonsense about the sea on my social media channels for entertainment purposes, I do put a lot of research into my podcast episodes. That being said, I'm an enthusiast, not an expert. If you are an expert, I welcome additional commentary or corrections. You can email me at deepbluediariespod@gmail.com. And I can't wait to talk to you next time on Deep Blue Diaries.